and 2, with top nonfiction books and authors every weekend. BookTV, television for serious readers.
Were you here?
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we both have dark hair.
I did.
So I'm going to take off my jacket. Okay, we might have a few latecomers, but they won't interrupt. They'll go around through the back. So first of all, we'd like to welcome you to the TWA Museum, and it's our pride and joy. We hope you enjoy it. We also, if you want to tour the museum, you'll have to go back out and around. And we have a Flight 800 room, which might be of interest to you all, especially after you hear Jack. So it's my pleasure to welcome Jack to the museum for this presentation. You're going to do questions and answers, so he'll be doing Q&A after his speech. Okay? So welcome, Jack.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and this is a great venue. I suspect it's the first time BookTV's ever done one from an airplane hangar. This is my 10th BookTV, but the one that's probably closest to my heart for a variety of reasons. And let me just start with a little background. And many of you know, on July 17th, 1996, at 8:19 p.m., TWA Flight 800 left JFK Airport in New York bound for Paris. 12 minutes later, at 8:31 p.m., off the coast of Long Island, the popular South Shore of Long Island, it was blown out of the sky. 230 people were killed. 53 of them were TWA employees. Many of you in this room knew at least some of those people. There is a memorial in their honor here at the TWA Museum. And if I were coming here to just spread some conspiracy theory, I would be dishonoring their memory and I would be insulting you. Instead, I'm here to tell you what happened on the night of July 17th, 1996, and the nights and days and months and years thereafter. There are people in this room who know a whole lot more about aviation than I do, and at the end of my conversation, I'm going to take questions and answers because I know some of you have firsthand experience with this tragedy. Here's what we know. In the last few years, researchers have unearthed a motherlode of new information from, of all places, the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, which raises the excellent question of what the CIA was doing involving itself in a domestic airplane crash. We'll get to that in a minute. And we've also gotten some interesting videos and a lot of whistleblowers from within inside the investigation have come forward. So the state of our knowledge today is much better than it was 20 years ago. When I say we, I got to give credit to the people who are doing a lot of the research here, like my sometimes partner James Sanders, physicist Tom Stalkup. Some of you know these people. Christina Borgeson, who came here and spoke, a former CBS producer. Ray Lair, a former Eastern Airline pilot and United Airline pilot and ALPA investigator. Attorney John Clark, the good people at Accuracy in Media, including Roger Aronoff, and Hank Hughes, senior NTSB investigator, and others. So they deserve a lot of the credit for digging up the information I'm going to share. Just wanted to let that be known. Since the book has come out, I've heard from at least 100 individuals from within the military or the aviation industry supporting my thesis. Many of them worked for and at the investigation itself. Many of them are still angry about what they experienced and what happened to them. Here's what we know. Now, according to an air traffic controller, in fact, this fellow contacted me after the book came out, and he just emailed me today, curiously, saying he loved the book and that he thanked me for treating his story accurately because I wrote about him. I did not release his name. He worked for 38 years as an air traffic controller, wants to keep his pension. He says, I have dependent children. And that is, you hear that from a lot of people. But what he told me that night, and this is a quote, he said, a primary radar return indicated vertical movement intersecting TWA 800. That's what they saw on their screens at TRACON in Westbury. And that is what precipitated the panic in Washington, D.C. That was the first notice. It wasn't the eyewitnesses. It came out of the air traffic control centers in New York that something had happened to this plane. And the seconds before it intersected that airplane, it disappears. And the TWA 800 notation disappears from the screen. The supervisor comes over to my correspondent, and he says, "Have you ever seen anything like this before?" And he said, "Yeah." He goes, "I used to do missile tests when I was in the Navy. We saw it all the time." So it wasn't something unknown to him. The next day, he comes back in, and he wants to review the tape. And he goes to the supervisor, "Can I take another look at that tape?" The supervisor says, "No, it's gone. It's been taken. This is a violation of all protocol, because tape is supposed to stay there for future adjudication." Now, the only person who has spoken about what happens next in Washington is Richard Clarke, the former anti-terror czar. He's both a liar and a braggart, so it's hard to sort through his information and get at the truth, but he at least spends some time on this. Everyone else who writes about that period of time in that administration is completely silent about the event. Not a word. Even though it was the #1 news story in 1996, and it was Richard Clarke titles the chapter "The Almost War of 1996." Clarke, and I think he's telling the truth here, convenes a meeting of his anti-terror group in the Situation Room in the White House at 9 o'clock, a half hour after the crash. I know from Hillary Clinton's logs and from my sources within the White House that the Clintons returned to the White House just about 8:30 after some routine fundraiser nearby. They retreated to the family quarters, and there they stayed for the rest of the night. They did not go down to the Situation Room. My source, who is a very good source, I asked him who was with them in the family quarters. He can only come up with one name. It was Sandy Berger. Now, Berger was the Deputy National Security Advisor. His boss, Tony Lake, was a National Security Advisor. And Lake has said this elsewhere, that he knew that when the conversation got political, he left the room. Berger was the political guy. Political decisions were about to be made. Among them was the insertion of the FBI into the investigation. One of my most helpful people in this book, and he's going to come into the story later on, I'll tell you about it. His name is Vernon Gross. He was a former NTSB board member. There's only 5 members on the National Transportation Safety Board. It's a pretty powerful position. And Vernon is one of the leading experts in the country on plane crashes. He was so knowledgeable that CNN called him in that night to do on-air interpretation of the events, on-air commentary. He spent the next 6 hours there. And as he tells me, he goes, "I wasn't there a couple hours, and already the FBI had taken over the investigation." He goes, "As a former board member of the NTSB, I knew that this was unprecedented and illegal because the NTSB was set up to be independent. And at that point, they sacrificed their independence and they yielded to the FBI." Now, what Vernon Gross, or no one knew at that time, was that some other insertion was taking place on that very first day. And this we know from the whole treasure trove of CIA documents that we've unearthed. And here's what we know. According to their own documents, quote, "The DI," that's the Director of Intelligence, "became involved in the missile theory the day after the crash occurred." The CIA has absolutely no business being involved in this kind of event, especially since the year before, in 1995, the Department of Justice sent out a memo. It's often known as the Wall Memo. And what the Wall Memo says is that there's a wall between the intelligence gatherers in the CIA and the criminal investigators in the FBI, and never the twain shall meet. They cannot collaborate because it would be, violate people's rights. Who knows? And George Tenet in 2004, at that point, was the director of Central Intelligence, the head of the CIA, and he told the 9/11 Commission that he was the first one to introduce that notion to the public about the wall. And he wasn't the only one who talked about it, but he was the first one to do it. But as the CIA documents prove, the CIA and the FBI for the next 16 months would collaborate on the TWA investigation. What they do not say outright is that the collaboration was designed to subvert the TWA 800 investigation. The CIA had no other role, as becomes incredibly clear when you read their documents, than to make all talk of missiles go away. Because on the opening night, that's all people were talking about within the first few hours. We know that there was at least one amateur video taken of the complete sequence of events. Some of you may have seen it. It was aired on MSNBC, to the best of my knowledge, probably 2 or 3 times. I talked to one of the fellows who was the technical director at MSNBC, and he said, yeah, we showed it a few times, and these 3 guys in suits came, took all copies, and told us to keep our mouths shut or else. And that was the end of that. Now, the best elaboration of what was seen, I got from a 747 pilot, and he was willing to give me his name, which you allow me to use his name, which is a sign of some confidence. He was laid up in a Hong Kong hospital with a back surgery, and his wife came to visit him. And they had nothing to do but watch TV for several weeks. This was during this whole sequence of events. And he said, we watched the video over and over again. He says, here's what we see. He said, there's a bunch of people milling around on a deck. And then someone says, oh, look at the fireworks. And then they see, and this is, a lot of other people would say the same thing, they see this object come up off the horizon. It has a red burning tip and a gray smoky contrail. And it's heading out to sea in an arch over. And then it disappears for a second. And then there's a bright white flash, another bright white flash, a big orange fireball, and the plane falls out of the sky. He saw this, he said, 30 to 50 times. He saw the video. Nelson DeMille would write a novel around this video, Nightfall, which is worth reading if you haven't read it. It's a lot of fun. Now we get into the CIA documents, and they get real interesting. On July 30th, 13 days after the crash, the CIA analysts, and I know the name of the head guy, I may or may not mention it later, meets with the FBI missile team. It's only a 2 or 3 man missile team. And he headlines the memo to his superior, and all the names are redacted, hold the presses, which is interesting. He tells his superior that he just met with the missile team. The missile team has already interviewed 144 excellent eyewitnesses to a missile attack on TWA Flight 800. He says the evidence for a missile attack, for a surface-to-air missile, is overwhelming, their word. He said these people are mainly professionals, and their testimony is too consistent for it to be anything but a missile attack. Now, the CIA analyst brags to his superior how he discouraged the FBI from going forward with its report, which was just about ready to be published. And he was successful, because that report never came forward. Between July 30th and August 17th, someone gets to the FBI. They came to the job intending to do it justice. Someone gets to them before August 17th, because on August 17th, the FBI speaks for the first time to the New York Times about eyewitnesses. Now, the FBI would speak almost exclusively to the New York Times. The New York Times became very dependent on that relationship. And in fact, at the heart of this story I'm telling is a media scandal. More than a government scandal, more than anything else, it's a media scandal. And at the heart of the media scandal is the New York Times. So they meet with the New York Times, and the story is reported on August 17th, so they probably met on the 15th or 16th, or about 2 weeks or so after the missile team met with the CIA. And the New York Times is told that there are fewer than a dozen credible eyewitnesses. And the New York Times is allowed to interview just one of those eyewitnesses. He's a good witness. His name's Michael Russell. He's on a barge. He's doing some surveying work. He's pretty knowledgeable. And he says he just sees out of the corner of his eye a bright white flash. And then he saw the plane fall immediately out of the sky. Now, that's two things that the NTSB would later deny happened, but at the time it served the purpose. The purpose then was to switch the scenario from missile to bomb. For whatever reason, the administration decided it could live with a bomb because a bomb wasn't as scary as a missile. By the way, this crash took place 2 days before the start of the Atlanta Olympics. So there's a lot at stake in keeping airlines flying and keeping, commercial traffic in gear, keeping people away from feeling insecure about taking airplanes. Now, in total, the New York Times would interview, let's say before it was through, the FBI would interview 258 eyewitnesses who saw an object streaking up and hitting the airplane. 96 of them saw it come up off the horizon, okay, and tracked it all the way up. Now, of those 258, do you know how many the New York Times would interview before the investigation was over? 0. I've talked to 20 or 30 of them. I mean, they're still there. They still want to tell their story. 0. They would speak to not a single one of those 258 official FBI witnesses. Now, 750 people in all gave reports to the FBI. Thousands more saw it because I know people who chose not to talk to the FBI, and they had good reason, as it turned out. But between the 15th, the 17th, and the 23rd, the New York Times kept running more stories about bombs. RDX found on the plane, PETN found on the plane, traces of missiles residue found outside the plane, inside the plane. On the 23rd of August, they ran this headline, above the fold right. Prime evidence found that device exploded in cabin of TWA 800. That's above the fold in the New York Times. Prime evidence found that, and they're pointing towards a bomb, but they're not ruling out missile, that it exploded in cabin of TWA 800. Above the fold left, Clinton signs welfare reform bill on eve of Democratic National Convention. One of those headlines had to go, and it was this one. And then the bomb talk just started going away. The day before the 23rd, I'm sure the Justice Department was aware that the FBI had been talking too much. So the head of the FBI investigation, Jim Kallstrom, is called to Washington for his first meeting in Washington. Heading up this meeting, as best as the information suggests, is Deputy Attorney General Jamie Gorelick. Her name will come back to play in this, so keep track of that. Her boss is Janet Reno. Reno was essentially a figurehead. She was the Attorney General. The Clintons didn't trust her. She didn't trust them. They worked around her. Just like they worked around Tony Lake in the National Security Council that threw Sandy Berger. And there is no record of what took place on that meeting on the 22nd, but we do know that all behaviors began to change immediately afterwards. From the 22nd on, there would be no more interviews with eyewitnesses for at least several months, and then those that took place later were done largely for the wrong reasons. We know that on the 23rd, the FAA started searching all over the world to see if they could find the day and a place where TWA Flight 800, the plane, was used for a dog training exercise with training aids, explosive training aids. It took them several weeks to find that, and then a series of events began to happen. Between the 23rd and the 19th of September, there was more stories about bomb residue, and the New York Times didn't know quite what direction to take, partly because the FBI didn't know what direction to take. And then on September 19th, the story switches to Washington, and now it's the NTSB leading the direction. And what they say is that perhaps it was a mechanical failure after all. They said a mechanical failure alone might just explain what happened to TWA 800. Well, this was a problem still because we had all the residue traces of explosives found over the plane. We had the headline, prime evidence found that bomb explodes. So how do we reconcile these two? Well, the next day, the FBI puts out a press release that the TWA 800 plane had been used for a training exercise in St. Louis 6 weeks before this happened. On the 21st of September, the New York Times runs an article saying that very same thing, and basically it kills the investigation. And the people who are doing, the serious investigators are saying, oh boy, it's going to be hard for us to make our case now that there was this thing, the bomb dog training exercise, sloppy, spilled explosives, et cetera, et cetera. By the 21st, neither the FBI or the New York Times had talked to the cop who did the training. The first person in the media to talk to that cop was me, 6 years after the fact. No one had talked to him in that time. And what they decided was that, he did his exercise. He's an African-American guy who's still, as he told me, excuse the language, pissed off to this day about what they did to him. Because what they did is they ruined his reputation. They ruined his reputation before they even talked to him. They concluded that he did a sloppy exercise. He had spilled training aids all over the plane, and those are what accounts for the explosive residues that were found on the plane. Well, the stuff that was found on the wing, Carlo, his dog, was not capable of getting out there and doing that, but that didn't matter. Or the stuff that was on the curtain separating the back and front, no, that didn't matter. They just went with it. Here's what they could have found out with an hour's worth of investigation. New York Times would have known this. The FBI, all that this cop put on his report was the time of the exercise and wide body. So he did do an exercise on a 747 on June 20th in St. Louis on a wide body, and he did it from 10:45 to 12:15 p.m. Here's what the FBI knew. They said at 12:30, the 800, TWA 800 plane left the gate. What the FBI did not say is that there were 400 people on board and they were bound for Hawaii. Now, as some of you who's worked on loading international flights know, you can't do that in 15 minutes. The cop did his exercise on a completely sterile plane. There was no one on board his plane for the whole time he did the exercise. They could have proved that in an hour, and it's easily proved. You can't even dispute it. That plane left at 12:35, 400 people stocked, fully ready to go to Honolulu, and they were supposed to believe that in that 20-minute exercise, 20-minute period, they did an hour and a half exercise. It just doesn't make any sense. Then there's other problems with it. They're obvious. The aids he used in no way match the composition of the residue found on the plane. Nor does it match where they placed it. The placement's wrong, the composition's wrong, the plane's wrong. It was a total lie. And there's no euphemism to disguise what they did. And they sacrificed this guy's career to get it done. And he's still humiliated to this day. He got letters from the FBI condemning him, etc., and he had to live with this. But that was the cover they needed. That was all the cover they needed. Now, from that point on, from September 21st or 2nd on, the government moved into a fully different mode, and that was the mechanical failure mode. And some of you are around to remember that. I've talked to a lot of TWA people who remember that like getting punched in the stomach when they heard that. Especially the people who worked in fuel tanks, because the fuel tank people would have to bear the brunt of that story, that there was something wrong with the fuel tank and it blew up. Well, in fact, when I get emails from people reading the book, the fuel tank people are the angriest, I will tell you that. At that point, too, the NTSB had been totally shut out of witness review. They were supposed to interview the eyewitnesses. They're supposed to review the statements. They were totally shut out. In fact, they were humiliated. They were sent home. The FBI wouldn't even let them look at the interviews after the FBI had done them. Instead, the FBI handed the interviews over to the CIA. Who else to examine interviews and to decide what it is that the eyewitnesses saw? They have absolutely no experience in this. They had not only no experience, but they have no legal justification for this. Now, the FBI wasn't eager to do this. You could see that. So when they gave them, the CIA, the witness statements in small doses. and in time. They only gave them finally 1/3 of the total eyewitness statements. I don't know why, just a third, but they were only working from a third of them. Didn't matter. On December 31st, 1996, the CIA analyst, his name's Randolph Taus, by the way. Randolph, if you're watching, give me a call sometime. Comes to the conclusion that all he needs to do to explain what these people saw is contained within the one plane itself. All they saw was Flight 800. He decides that the nose of the plane was blown off, then the plane tilted almost 90 degrees upright, about 70 or 80 degrees, and then noseless, and people, aviators in this room know what a crock this is, it shot up about 4,000 feet, and then in the course of that, deceived people into thinking they were seeing a missile. Now, I've talked to many, many aviators, and they just hit their head when they saw that one. They said, this is nuts. This can't happen. And it said, so they went from 13,000 something feet to 17,000 plus feet. And he said that's what confused them. Now, we'll get back to that in a second because it becomes they're also contracted with creating a video to show that. And that was what they would close the case. Now, we know that happened on December 31st. By February 1997, George Tenet, who's now been promoted to the director of Central Intelligence, he's a political guy too. He had been the #2 guy when this all started. They fired the #1 guy, John Deutsch, promote Tenet. He signs off on this. Yeah, that's what it was. Nose of the plane falls off, shoots upright, sends a letter to Louis Freeh. This is what it is. Then one heroic character from the FBI stands up. And I've identified this guy by name. I'm not sure whether I should mention it tonight, but he's basically the head of the now 2-man missile team. The fact that there's only 2 men on the FBI missile team tells you something. But on April 29th, 1997, he meets with the CIA. And he says, I don't buy this for a moment. He says, we have at least 30 eyewitnesses who saw the object coming in the opposite direction of TWA. So it couldn't have been TWA in crippled flight that they saw. He said, we have at least 8 eyewitnesses who saw the missile hit the airplane. He said, all the radar data totally disagrees with what you're trying to sell us. He goes, I insist that you go back to the drawing board and start over, because this I won't buy this. I don't buy this. Now, the other member of the missile team, apparently according to the CIA analyst, was okay with the CIA. This one guy refused not to do it. I'm going to name him. His name's Steve Bongard. Trying to touch him, reach him. Steve, if you're listening, get in touch. He then, and I don't think he knew this until recently, on that same April 29th, 1997 day that he's fighting with the CIA, either in Washington or New York, he ends up in North Carolina, at least on paper he does, interviewing one of the key eyewitnesses in this book, and this story is witness number 73. I start out the book with the story of witness 73. Some of you read this. And I'll just replay the story a little bit. In 2009, the summer of 2009, I get a call out of the blue. And she goes, Jack Cashill? I said, yeah. She goes, this is witness 73. Do you know who I am? I said, yes, I do. I said, upside down Nike swoosh, right? She goes, that's me. Here's the story. And the FBI writes out these, what they're called 302s, that they're witness summaries. And here's what the FBI's witness summary from July 20th, 1996 says about their interview with witness number 73. I'm going to call her Sandy, just to give her a name. It's a name I give her in the book. It's not her real name. So they're talking to Sandy. Sandy tells them she's on the beach with 2 of her in-laws, and she sees, and she's aviation, she has an interest in aviation because she's a travel professional. She's tracking Flight 800s that comes across the sky. She said she thought it was awfully low, considering how far it was out of JFK, and she was right because they had held the altitude down for innocent reasons. And then she says, I see this object come up off the horizon, and it has a red tip, a smoky contrail. It comes up, she's watching it, arc, zigzag, out, over. She says, bam, it explodes right outside the right wing. Bam, another explosion. Then she said, I see the nose of the plane come off, And then she said, stalls and falls right out of the sky, breaks into flames, into an orange fireball. Now, 3 days after the crash, Sandy had explained and told the FBI the breakup sequence of that aircraft, with the nose coming off first, before anyone knew. It would take them weeks to map out the debris field before they could validate what she had said. But no one saw it more clearly than she did. And she cooperated fully with the FBI 3 days later. And her two in-laws had wanted nothing to do with it. Her husband, who wasn't with her, almost broke off their engagement. They were engaged at that time because she talked to the FBI. The in-laws were really upset that she gave them their names, but they refused to talk. They saw what she did. Maybe they had good reason. On April 29, 1997, the same day that Steve Bongard is protesting to the CIA in Washington or New York, he's down in North Carolina interviewing, probably unknown to him, Sandy. Same day. Because the CIA said, oh, we'll take care of that. Yeah, they took care of it. They put in a new 302 into her file, okay? And here's what Sandy told me when we talked in 2009. She goes, because I asked her, I said, tell me about the second interview. She goes, oh, there's a lot you don't know about that. And I said, what? She goes, well, in the second interview, she had just found out about it. She said, it said I had had several Long Island iced tea cocktails that night. And I said, and? She goes, I don't even know what a Long Island iced tea is. And I said, could it have been another drink? She said, no. I said, you sure? She goes, no, I don't drink at all. And then then she said, there's something you don't know. I said, what's that? She goes, there was no second interview. The CIA had fully manufactured a second interview that same day to negate her testament on the same day that the FBI head of the missile team gave them grief about what they were doing. And then there's something, and then I said to her, there's something you don't know. She said, what's that? I said, you're not the only one. As I'll explain, they did that to several key eyewitnesses. That is, manufacture out of whole cloth, fully new witness statements to justify the theory they were trying to sell. In a later meeting, and this was published in about 1999, with the NTSB, the CIA analysts conceded that only one witness had actually reported seeing the crippled plane with the nose come off climb. And he was the man on the bridge. And I've gotten to know the man on the bridge pretty well, and his wife are great characters. His name's Mike Wire. He works out of Philadelphia. He's a millwright. And when they closed the case with the FBI in November 1997, they showed for one time, and many of you have seen this, the animation showing the plane flying along, nose blows off spontaneously, fuel tank explosion. Guys who work in fuel tanks, you got to do a better job in the future. And the plane shoots up 3,000 to 4,000 feet, confuses the eyewitnesses. The eyewitnesses do not see a missile. It sounds like a Soviet propaganda if you've ever seen the language and the graphics. And they built it all around, they finally conceded to the NTSB some years later, around the testimony of this one man, Mike Wire, the man on the bridge. And it turns out, of course, that they based it on a second interview with Mike Wire. Because in his first interview, he said exactly what Sandy said. I saw the thing come up off the beach, blah, 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 sparkle over, went over, boom, 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 boom. And the second interview goes, no, I didn't see it come up off the beach. I saw it about 20 degrees off the horizon when I first saw it. Yeah, it could have been Flight 800 and crippled flight, of course, right? They just made that up and put it into the record. There was no second interview with Mike Wire. There was no second interview with Sandy. A fellow who was flying above it, who was a Navy guy with real missile experience and everything, saw it out of his plane on his U.S. airplane, and they made up a new interview for him. Because in his thing, he said, I saw a missile going from right to left. No, and they said on the thing, and his second new 302, no, he saw it going from left to right. It must have been Flight 800, right? They did this for at least 3 that we know of. There are probably more, but these are the ones that we've been able to prove. And finally, going through CIA documents we just found a year or so ago, we find out that they say, and this is a quote, that the maximum calculated altitude for TWA 800 post-explosion was 14,500 feet. They knew that. Not the 17,000 plus feet they sold to the American people. They showed that video once when the FBI closed the case in November, and no one in the media even asked, what's the CIA doing here? Let alone this stuff is nuts. How can you possibly be trying to sell us this? Now then, another, James Sanders, who worked with me on one previous book and who was the earliest explorer on this, calls me one day about a year ago, goes, Jack, you won't believe what happened. They just sent me the video. And I said, the video? You know? He goes, because Jim had been sending Freedom of Information Act requests to the FBI for some time. And when we get it and we look at it, we realize it is not the video from July 17th, but it's almost as useful. It's a video we knew about from July 12th, 1996. And it was a video shot from the south coast of Long Island by an amateur. We knew it existed because both the FBI and the CIA talked about it. But it was a video of an apparent missile test. The Defense Intelligence Agency had reviewed the video early on and said, yeah, this is a surface-to-air missile we're looking at. And they talked about the smoke trail going up, blah, blah, blah. Well, when we saw the video, we realized it was more than just a smoke trail coming up. We saw the flaming debris coming down. This was 5 days before TWA Flight 800 went down on the south coast of Long Island, an obvious missile test taking place. Now, that wouldn't matter a whole lot, except when the FBI closed its case in November 1997, they said there had been no missile test in the area for at least 2 years. They know that this happened. They knew about this video. They did not enter that video into evidence. And from the CIA documents, we also know that many eyewitnesses saw what it looked like a missile test on July 7th, 1996. So you have July 7th, you have July 12th, you have to be July 17th. You don't have to be a math major to see the sequence here. It's every 5 days. After my book came out, I heard from other people who said, you know, I don't know if this matters, but on July 7th, I was camping, you know, and I saw this. Yeah, it does matter. Because that was what was going on. Now, from November 1997 on, the case was basically closed. The NTSB held 2 hearings. No eyewitnesses were allowed to testify. First time ever, totally unprecedented. Basically, they get away with it. It's the most successful cover-up in American peacetime history. The great untold story of our time. And 53 of your colleagues died without justice being brought to them or their families. Now, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. Now I'm going to take some questions and answers here and add some other little useful anecdotes. But the Deputy Attorney General who oversaw this investigation, Jamie Gorelick, in May of 1997, after this is essentially put to bed, gets a new job. Despite the fact that she has no experience in either mortgage or finance, she's named Vice Chairman of Fannie Mae. And the next 5.5 years, next 6 years, she'll make $25 million as Vice Chairman of Fannie Mae. And then a burst of patriotism, she steps down to take one of 5 Democratic positions on the 9/11 Commission. So she is basically overseeing the events leading up to September 11th. In April of 2004, Attorney General John Ashcroft testifies to the 9/11 Commission. And he says, this is a quote, "The single greatest structural cause for September 11th was the wall." This is the wall memo that prevented the CIA and the FBI from speaking to each other. I should note that Steve Bongart, the head of the FBI missile team that I mentioned, protested loudly about the wall in the run-up to September 11th, and he went public with this protest. And because there was a terrorist afoot in America, he said, and we can't look for him because we're the investigators and it's an intelligence issue? He goes, this is nuts. Well, 2 weeks after he says that, he goes, people are going to die. 2 weeks later, this fellow joins 18 of his buddies, and they hijack the 4 planes and kill 3,000 people because of the wall. And so, full disclosure, Ashcroft continues, compels me to inform you that the author of the wall memorandum is a member of this commission. The author of that wall memo was Ms. Jamie Gorelick. So as the nation learned in the aftermath of 9/11, the wall that was breached all too easily to protect the secrets of TWA 800 held all too firmly when it came to protecting the security of the United States. And that's where we are today. Now, I'm going to close with one last anecdote because it's just sort of a lighter, fun anecdote. And then we'll take some questions. And when we take questions, by the way, if you could speak up, because we're just picking up the ambient noise. In early July of this year, Accuracy in Media, an excellent organization out of Washington, hosted a press conference at the National Press Club on TWA Flight 800. They invited me to speak. And I talked to Vernon Gross, the NTSB board member, the night before. And, excuse me. If I start coughing, by the way, just ignore it. Nothing. So Vernon, I didn't even know he lived in Washington area. I said, why don't you come down to Press Club and, and check it out. So he comes down, and then we invite him up to speak, and he speaks for about 10 minutes. And then he says to me afterwards, he goes, by the way, tomorrow I'm having lunch with the chairman of the National Transportation Safety Board, He said, you want to come? I said, yeah, sure. Why not? Well, so I go to lunch, and I meet the new chairman of the National Transportation Safety Board. His name is Christopher Hart. And I'm looking for a point of connection with Christopher Hart. And I'm trying not to push my book. Vernon is, but I'm not. I'm just laying back, trying to convince him that I'm sane, and this is a story that's worth looking at. And then I realized what it was. He mentioned that he had been on the board between 1989 and 1992 when Clinton replaced him. Now, what was interesting about that is I'd written about that in the book, but I didn't know who Hart was. I didn't know anything about his background. Other than that, he had an aerophysics degree from Princeton, a law degree from Harvard, and he was an instrument-rated pilot. And as the Washington Post pointed out at the time, he was replaced by Jim Hall, whose best qualification was his driver's license, right? This is what the Washington Post said at the time. And I said, I wrote about that in my book. And he said, I posted that on my wall, the article from the Washington Post. Well, here are two things I didn't know about Christopher Hart until I met him. One is that he's a Democrat. So he replaced a Democrat with a Democrat. He replaced a Democrat with extraordinary credentials with one with no credentials. The other thing is this. He's an African American, right? So to replace a black Democrat with a white hack Democrat is an act of the foresight of the Clinton administration to pack these boards with people who are going to come in handy. Well, he adds two more people before 1996, both of them political operatives. So by the time 1996 comes, Jim Hall is now the chairman, and you have 3 of the 5 board members. And so when the FBI illegally takes over the investigation, they just roll over, take it, and they watched it all happen. And that's what I found out. So anyhow, that's how clever, in a sense, and this was, and what was otherwise a sort of awkward, improvised cover-up that was done essentially just to kick that can down the road past November and hope for the best. And they've kicked it now for 20 years, and let's hope they can stop kicking with a little help from BookTV. So thank you very much, and I appreciate your coming today. Now, questions, you just speak up, okay? You might want to stand up, too, if you don't mind. If you can, take out your seatbelts and right.
So I'm just gathering then that the reason for the cover-up was the military screwed up and the Clintons wanted to cover that up.
I would say, when I started this investigation, there's a certain thing called confirmation bias. You see a set of facts and you want them to confirm what you hope will be the outcome. Well, when I first got into this in the year 2000, I hoped the outcome would be terrorists. I would just feel more comfortable with that. Because I remember when Pierre Salinger came forward and saying it was the Navy, I said, that can't be the Navy. I felt that was almost unpatriotic of him to say that. Well, unfortunately, the evidence overwhelmingly points to naval involvement on the night of July 17th. Now, there may have been some rogue element that snuck in there. There may have been an Allied ship in the maneuvers. I don't know. I do not know literally who fired the missile. but I know that missiles were fired, and I know that missiles took down Flight 800. The evidence overwhelmingly argues for Navy involvement, and the smoking gun was there from the beginning. And that is that what everyone acknowledged, except for the New York Times, which chose not to acknowledge anything of essence, there was a Navy P-3 Orion hovering right above TWA Flight 800 when it blew up. Now, at the time, there were technical manuals easily available. I went back and found them, in which the P-3 is used as a communications mode and what's called a cooperative engagement capability, where various ships and submarines cooperate to do a missile test or to shoot other missiles out of the sky, shoot planes out of the sky. And it was sitting right there. We also know that there were other ships in the area, finally, at least 3 submarines and 1 cruiser. So we know that they were there. We know that. Now, who fired what? I do not know. But yes, Navy was there. Yes, sir. In a TWA shirt?
In your book, you mentioned 3 submarines.
Yes.
The Trepang, the Wyoming, and the Albuquerque.
Yes.
There was an article that came out on the internet, which I don't trust the internet terribly, but it blatantly said that the missile that was fired by the Seawolf.
Yes.
Which was not even commissioned until a year and 2 days after the accident.
That's right. No, and I've seen that report. It has a ring of credibility to it. I've tried to check it out because there are a couple names mentioned who were on the Seawolf. And I've tried to contact those people. And guess what? They don't return my phone calls.
What a surprise.
Yeah. I wouldn't rule that out. That was not mentioned as being right. The FBI conceded there were 3 submarines, the ones you mentioned, and the USS Normandy in the immediate vicinity of the crash. We also know that from day one, the Navy was lying to the FBI. The Navy never came forward. Christina Borgeson, who spoke here, was witness to one incident where someone asked, why is the Navy involved in this investigation when the Navy may be the culprit? And what they did is they picked up this guy and they hustled him right out of the room. You know?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I've had at least 2 eyewitnesses to that. So that said, the Navy would not have and could not have covered this up on its own. It had to come from above. Yes, sir.
Do you have any theories of motive?
Motive, accident, you know.
Just an accidental
Yeah,
act.
right. A lot of people have asked me, was there anyone on that plane who deserved his or her own missile? And the answer is no. No, they would not shoot down. The U.S. Navy would not shoot down one of our own aircraft too. But we know that in 1988, the U.S. Navy did shoot down an Iranian Airbus, a passenger plane. So accidents can happen.
And the reluctance to admit it would just be embarrassment.
Well, I would say the reluctance to admit it had a lot to do with the election in 1996. Because the Navy wasn't going to, they couldn't have kept this under wraps. They might have fudged a little, but they weren't going to keep it under wraps. Yeah, in the back, sir.
At the risk of a gruesome detail, either from your book or other reading I've done, I read that the doctor that performed the autopsy found a large amount, and specifically those people seated in B zone, which was the business class cabin. Specifically, he found large amounts of shrapnel, and much of it tested positive for solid rocket fuel propellant. Any thoughts on how that was covered up or what might have been going on there? Because I've also heard that the autopsy doctor has been silenced as well.
Well, if those of you who saw Christina Borgeson here in July, she wrote and directed a documentary with Tom Stalkup called TWA Flight 800, which is excellent. Came out 3 years ago. And two of the people who they had at least a half a dozen high-level whistleblowers participate. 2 of them were the pathologists. And when I was watching that, I thought you could have made a separate documentary, and it would be a gruesome one, on what happened to the bodies. Because in a fuel tank explosion, they're going to burn. It's going to be ugly, but they're going to burn. But in this case, in some cases, the DNA were fused from one body into another. There were pieces of bone flying around like arrowheads, sticking into the side of the fuselage. And they showed some of this. And these guys got to have pretty tough stomachs to do this. But the injuries were not at all consistent with the fuel tank fire, at least to those that were in the place where the explosive devices were most damaging. Yeah, good question. Yes, ma'am.
What do they do with all the wreckage? So, do they destroy it?
No, the greater part of the wreckage was reassembled at the Calverton hangar in Long Island where they did the investigation. And now it has since been shipped to the NTSB training facility in Virginia. And it's used as sort of like a dumb show for people, and they walk them through and say, see, it's no holes here, no missile struck here, its use is very questionable. Mike?
Well, as you point out there, this was not the first commercial airliner shut down by a Navy destroyer. I thought it was 91, you say 88.
Yes.
But anyway, we shot down a Iranian airliner at the beginning of the Gulf War, shortly thereafter. And the captain testified that the aircraft, the Iranian airliner, they didn't know what it was. It was diving and turning and accelerating toward his ship, and he gave the command to fire. Okay, we understand that. But unfortunately, the Russians had a satellite parked above. You'd like to see that, It recorded everything. And they said, no, that Iranian airline was at 22,000 feet in the middle of an airway and let them fly. Well, the Navy had to eat crow. I'm sure the captain got a promotion. But from what I understand, we had the same satellite parked over New York, United 800. And no one's ever seen the satellite tapes of that incident. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, there were allegedly 3 satellites that had Flight 800 in its view. One of the parents from Pennsylvania, whose daughter was killed in a crash, there was a group of French students, like 15 of them, who were going to Paris that night. He used his, as a family member, he was allowed a certain leeway, and he got to talk to them. He said there were 3 satellites that night, and they were all malfunctioning. That's what he was told. That's literally what he was told. And so, no, there's never been anything seen from them. And yet, when the CIA created its animation of the zoom climb, of the nose falling off and a plane shooting up, they claimed that infrared sensors on a U.S. satellite, blah, blah, blah. But they've never shown any images. They just were talking at a school. It didn't show anything like that. Yes, Terry?
What about the compensation for the family members? Some paid them compensation for their death?
Well, there's a lot of TWA people here. I know I've talked to a lot of angry TWA people about this one, but let me talk about Boeing first. Boeing and TWA took the fall, basically. And then you say, why would they do that? Well, in Boeing's case, it was pretty obvious. They were in the middle of a merger talk with McDonnell Douglas, which would have given them essentially 100% lock on the American commercial airline market. And the same week that and this was at that time, exactly at that time, and the same week that the Department of Justice approved that merger, they turned down a merger between Office Depot and Staples, which would have given them a 6% lock on the crucial office supply market. So Boeing, if they wanted to survive, really didn't have much choice. TWA, I've heard a lot of stories about why TWA went along, and probably not a good place to go into them all right now, but afterwards we might want to talk, because I've talked to many TWA people who have their theories, but anyhow, for a lot of people, I think it was the death knell of the airline, and 4 years later it would be out of business. And merging, though, with American Airlines, at least for some unhappy short period, and then moving on. But yeah, it's unfortunate. Yes, sir.
I got to say, I worked fuel tanks, and I was at work on 800 tanks. I've been irritated about this for 20 years after listening to you for an hour. I'm more irritated. To answer your question, I was at Christina's slideshow she had here, and about those pieces. Well, she had one of her slides had what they did with the rest of the airplane, and it was all ground up, and I went to a recycling place, and she showed large, very large hoppers full of red and white metal.
Yeah. And then I think they had second thoughts, and they took it down to Virginia and reconstructed it.
I think this was after that.
Yeah, after. Okay.
This was a recycling.
Yeah, yeah.
But these were small pieces.
Right.
Well, I worked a little on the 47 fuel tank, more on 10, 11, 7, 20, 7. in the 80s, 5, 7, 6, 7s, but I remember immediately after when this went down, within a week, I had said something earlier, the NTSB came on and says, well, a fuel pump shorted out in the center tank. Well, there's no fuel pumps in the center tank, so they're all on the outside of the wing. There's no wires, there's no pumps, there's no nothing. So everybody we're at MCA, I'll use the word pissed off, because we knew they were lying.
Well, you know, and at the end of the day, after 4 years, the spark that sets off the fuel tank is of unknown origin, right? The overheating of the center fuel tank for sitting on the runway at JFK is 71 degrees. These planes sit on runways in Cairo and Phoenix, you know, and they send all the time.
Well, I've been in fuel tanks with this much fuel. You step over and stuff.
Right.
In my experience with explosives in the military, the center tank blew up, but it wouldn't have made a difference if there was 2 gallons or 20,000 gallons in there. If you have an explosion come in there, it's going to blow up.
Oh, it did explode. I mean, some seconds after the whole plane caught fire and whatnot, you know. Yeah.
The county that I live in, they got a historical society. I went to some function, I forget what it was. I got talking to one guy, and somehow I came up, I was retired from TWA. He said, well, I retired from the FBI.
Yeah, well, I'm coming.
I said, really? I says, what do you think about Flight 800? His shoulder's not bad. He said, I'll tell you right now, he said, I was married to that airplane for 4 years, and a missile did not take it down. So I said, is that what you believe, or is that what you were told to believe?
Yes.
I haven't talked to him since.
Well, you know, I have heard that story. Yeah. I've heard that story several times. And in fact, Nelson DeMille, has anyone read Nightfall, his book, which is really a very good read? A little steamy opening chapter, you want to get beyond that, but I just listened to it driving back cross country, and it's a lot of fun. It's based around the missing video, and he comes to the same conclusion that I did, basically. But he was deeply involved in research on Long Island for some of his other books, and he knew a lot of FBI agents, and every time he ran into one, he'd get that same stone wall, you know? Yeah. He said, now the NYPD or the Suffolk County Police would be much more forthcoming, but the FBI, it was a fuel tank explosion, you know? I mean, they stick to they've gotten their marching orders, and they do it. And the fellow on the missile team that I referred to earlier, he did his 20 years and got out. And I think that's because for certain people, that kind of culture is very difficult to abide when something's going wrong. In the back, yes, sir.
A few weeks ago, I know I was coming to the lecture, and I happened to be in California. I have a friend who's with the Douglas Aircraft in Long Beach. He retired as an engineer with Boeing. So I told him I was coming here and what the lecture was about. And so he told me, he said, and then I told him I joined the TWA museum a few years back, and we were talking about Flight 800. And I said, you know, the people at the TWA museum, they'll look you right in the eye, and they'll flat out tell you that plane was shot down. There's no doubt in their mind. And he looks at me and he says, I can look you in the eye too, and I can tell you, just to talk amongst the Boeing people and the engineers, that plane was shot down. Now, at the same time, he also sent me a video clip of George Stephanopoulos. I don't know if you've seen this.
I've seen on 9/11?
Well, when he talked about, and then he goes back and he talks about how Flight TWA was shot down. Oops, I mean, went down. Right. And of course, he was in the Clinton administration. So, this is my statement. Here's my question. This cover-up that we're talking about here is like so massive beyond anything you could almost believe. We're talking about the FAA, the TSB, the FBI, the CIA, people putting extra things in other people's files. I mean, the New York Times, if a dog gets hit by a car in New York City, they got 50 reporters on it, and all of a sudden they're shut down.
Right.
So when you look at all of this, and you think of all the time, all the effort, somebody had to coordinate it. And at the same time, let's look at Clinton was president. The FBI and the CIA and the military people, he was not their favorite guy.
No.
He was weak, he was the draft dodger. Why would they protect him? So with all this, all you have to do is look at the missiles, you can look at the films, you can look at these things. It's a slam dunk. But my question is, and I'll leave it this way, with all of this massive work that it took to do this, as much as they disliked Clinton and the military and the CIA and everything, And the question is not only why would they protect him, but why wouldn't the government just say, you know what, we screwed up. We're going to write a check. We messed up. What would have been the fallout from that? Clinton didn't order the plane to be shut down.
No, in
so
fact...
they would have said, here's so much per person, here's so much for the airplane, we messed up, we had a missile test going on out there, and that would have been the end of it. So my question is, why?
You know, and I will tell, here's my best answer, is that on the night of July 17th, 1996, they panicked. And then they decided to kick this can down the road. And once you start kicking it, you can't kick it back. Then what you're doing is you're covering for yourself. And despite all the people who seem to be involved, I don't think there's, other than a couple of people in the Navy, I don't think there's 6 to 10 civilians who really know what happened that night. And here's what they share with us. Stephanopoulos, you're right, talks about it accidentally on 9/11, right? He writes a book about it. He writes a book. He doesn't even mention the incident. George Tenet, who's the head of, who oversaw the cover-up from the CIA position, writes a book, doesn't mention it. Leon Panetta is the one who alerts Clinton, doesn't mention it. Bill Clinton writes a 900-page book, 1 paragraph. Hillary Clinton, 500-page book, 1/3 of a sentence. Louis Freeh, head of the FBI at the time, 2 sentences. I mean, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, which covers all of those matters, certainly everything that's involved with the CIA from 1996 to 97, doesn't mention it. It's a conspiracy of silence. They've kicked it down the memory hole. My hope, and this is bizarre, I'm going to put out an appeal right now, is I think the one person of conscience in all of this who's suffered most from having to live with this was the head of the FBI investigation, Jim Kallstrom, who's now on Fox as their terrorist go-to guy, which means Fox won't talk about this. But I know he's tortured. I know family members who've come up to him in his face and said, "You're lying." And he is the public face of this investigation. And if anyone, I think, has an interest in coming forward and just clearing the air, I think it would be he. And what I would recommend, because who arrests who at this point? I would say what you need is like a South Africa-style Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where you just, okay, we're going to waive all punishment, and let's just sort out the facts and hope this doesn't happen again. Yes, sir.
Interesting how this is working out. I've been in aviation maintenance since 1988. I was with TWA, several airlines here in the Kansas City area. I started out as an airframe electrician in the L-1011 fuel tanks, replacing the wiring, supervision, management, the whole line. I'm in safety now, that part of the house, but through all of this, you talk about kicking the can along. We're still kicking the can. We have a terrible burden of grief for those who lost loved ones. We have a terrible financial burden with this now. We're still following this can down the road, trying to keep fuel tanks from exploding that don't explode. Right now, here in Kansas City, we're installing inert gas systems that are hugely expensive on every single aircraft across the board. You just, like you say, this reconciliation, when is it going to stop? Because we're just pouring money and resources down this hole. And
and what happened is that immediately after this crash, had they really thought it was a fuel tank explosion, they would have grounded all the 747s. Certainly Air Force One, which was a 747, but that didn't happen. Yeah.
I was managing a fleet of 737s at the time. They grounded 737s. And said, you got to go look at everything in your tank, all your wiring. We said, you know what, we're just going to pull all the wiring. We grounded our whole fleet, pulled the wiring out, the leading edges, all of that. We found one wire, and these were old 200 basics, old 737s. We found one wire on our fleet of, I think we had 18 737s at the time. One wire that had one spot that was aged, and it was in a conduit on the outside of the front spar. You would think that you would find some mechanical, some electrical problem. I have yet to see one in all of these years.
And that's why at the end of the investigation for the NTSB, they simply concluded, must have been of unknown origin. They don't know where that spark came from. And then we found out, by the way, from the CIA documents, that their head of the witness team at the time, a guy named David Mayer, was working with the CIA. He worked with them for 16 months. But so the NTSB is working with the CIA? I mean, there were people in the NTSB who were problematic. Most of the people, by the way, 99% of the people involved in the investigation were doing the right thing or trying to, including most of the FBI. But there are a few people in key positions who weren't. And they just allowed things to happen. And when you meet, in fact, I was just talking to this air traffic control guy I mentioned earlier, just emailed me today, and he said, you're right. He goes, you were right to mention pensions. He goes, because I said the word pension is like, for us what the word omerta is in Sicily. I mean, it guarantees silence. He said, but I worked 38 years as an air traffic controller. He said, they take that away from me. I'm finished, And that has for the people who work in and around government, it has a great silencer. Also what happens is so many of these people end up working for defense contractors. And then if they go public, they not only risk their pensions and their freedom, but they risk their whole company's connections with the government. And so there's a lot of low-level fear among people who know stuff. And like I say, there's only a handful of I would say, bad people involved, but a lot of people just afraid to speak out. Yes, sir.
What happened to the captain of the Coast Guard boat?
The captain of the Coast Guard boat, I do not know about that. There is, I will say that there was just one angle of the story we have not talked about is that on the night of July 17, 1996, the Coast Guard went out there, as did a lot of just commercial fishermen and private yachtsmen and stuff. And many of them heard the distinctive ping from the black boxes, the flight data recorder, cockpit voice recorder. They're actually orange boxes, but they're... and so it was only 120 feet of water. It was calm. They, other than the bodies, this is the first thing that gets picked up. It took them a week to retrieve them. During that week, they were putting out various stories. Oh, they must be damaged. They must be buried. And I've seen the video of the actual Navy divers finding them. And it's like finding a hassock in your living room. I mean, it's just sitting there on the floor, a big orange box. They pick it up. Oh, I mean, and they were innocent. They just picked it up saying, wow, we found them. And then when they tested them, of course, they revealed nothing. And then one of the family members was able to bring in an audio expert, and he said, yeah, with the final seconds have been edited out. And the NTSB didn't even disagree with that. They said, well, they're just missing. It's one of those things that are missing, like the 116 pieces of the plane that were sent to the FBI lab and never seen again. So, so many things were subtracted, deleted, removed, stolen, covered up, destroyed. But the one thing they could not silence were the eyewitnesses. And they were the most critical part of this testimony, and they are continuing to speak out to this day. Why don't we take one more question, and then I think we probably ought to better wrap it up here before you guys melt.
Okay.
Are you guys right? Any other questions? Yes, Mike.
Well, this is not a question exactly, but the way they treated Captain Terry Stacy, because James Sanders asked him to put a piece of the orange residue on the back of the seat backs and submit it to an independent lab. And Terry did that, and then analyzed the residue, and it was missile residue. It had all the elements of missile residue. And the way the FBI went after Terry Stacy, threatening with prison, went after his wife Liz, and hounded them for like 18 months. I mean, they stalked his wife Liz, who was a flight attendant, mercilessly. They threatened Captain Stacy with years in federal prison for removing evidence from a crash site, and they just went berserk when over him, because they didn't want that word missile to ever be mentioned again, and they didn't want anybody to ever attempt to prove it wasn't missile like Terry Stacy did. So that to me convinced that this was just a sham, a fake investigation from day one.
And in fact, that's what got me started, because 4 years after the crash, I met James and Elizabeth Sanders, who came to Kansas City to speak to a large TWA group. And you're right, Sanders is an investigative reporter. Terry Stacy was the 747 manager and pilot working at the investigation. And the first, and what happened is, and Liz Sanders was a TWA trainer, and 53 TWA employees were killed in that crash. She knew a lot of them. She trained a lot of them. And she was heartbroken. She was going from one memorial service to another. She runs into Stacy, and Stacy says to her, "Hey, is your husband still an investigative reporter?" And she says, "Yes." She goes, "Have him talk to me." So Stacy and Sanders get together, and the first thing Stacy tells Sanders is, there's a cover-up going on. And so they started collaborating to get information out of the investigation into the mainstream. And one thing that Stacy told Sanders was this orange residue on these seat backs. And in one certain section of the plane, Sanders asks him to scrape off the residue. It doesn't scrape. So he takes a pinch of foam rubber, puts it in a FedEx envelope, sends it to Sanders. Sanders has it tested, goes public with the results. As a result of that, Stacy, Sanders, and Elizabeth Sanders are hounded, finally arrested. Elizabeth and James are tried and convicted in a federal court of conspiracy to steal airplane parts. And not a single person in the media raised this as a First Amendment issue. And when I heard that story, that's when I said, maybe I better get involved in this. So I want to thank you all for coming out. It's an excellent crew. It won't shock you to know that I have some books over there for sale. I appreciate it. And if you want to stick around later and ask questions, and I will say this, by the way, if you know anyone who has information, have them go to my website, cashill.com, and talk to me. We'll communicate through that, okay? Appreciate it.
Yeah,